Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining me again for another chapter of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. We're starting today with chapter 23, which is called Square Candies That Look Round. It's a super short chapter, so we will also read chapter 24, which is called Veruca in the Nut Room. Here we go. Everybody stopped and crowded to the door. The top half of the door was made of glass. Grandpa Joe lifted Charlie up so that he could get a better view, and looking in, Charlie saw a long table, and on the table were rows and rows of small, white, square-shaped candies. The candies looked very much like square sugar lumps, except that each one of them had a funny little pink face painted on one side. And at the end of the table, a number of Oompa Loompas were busily painting more faces on more candies. "There you are," cried Mr. Wonka. "Square candies that look round." "They don't look round to me," said Mike TV. "They look square," said Veruca Salt. "They look completely square." "But they are square," said Mr. Wonka. "I never said they weren't." "You said they were round," said Veruca Salt. "I never said anything of the sort," said Mr. Wonka. "I said they looked round." "But they don't look round," said Veruca Salt. "They look square." "They look round," insisted Mr. Wonka. "They most certainly do not look round," cried Veruca Salt. "Veruca, darling," said Mrs. Salt, "pay no attention to Mr. Wonka. He's lying to you." "My dear old fish," said Mr. Wonka, "go and boil your head." "How dare you speak to me like that?" shouted Mrs. Salt. "Oh, do shut up," said Mr. Wonka. "Now watch this." He took a key from his pocket and unlocked the door and flung it open, and suddenly, at the sound of the door opening, all the rows and rows of little square candies looked quickly round to see who was coming in. The tiny faces actually turned toward the door and stared at Mr. Wonka. "There you are," he cried triumphantly. "They are looking round. There's no argument about it. They are square candies that look round." Here's the picture. "By golly, he's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Come on," said Mr. Wonka, starting off down the corridor again. "On we go. We mustn't dawdle." "Butterscotch and Buttergin," it said on the next door as they passed. "Now that sounds a bit more interesting," said Mr. Salt, Veruca's father. "We really mustn't keep stopping like this. Follow me, please." He turned left, he turned right. He came to a long flight of stairs. Mr. Wonka slid down the banisters. The three children did the same. Mrs. Salt and Mrs. TV, the only women now left in the party, were getting very out of breath. "This way," cried Mr. Wonka, turning left at the bottom of the stairs. "Go slower," panted Mrs. Salt. "Impossible," said Mr. Wonka. "We should never get there in time if I did." "Get where?" asked Veruca Salt. "Never you mind," said Mr. Wonka. "You just wait and see." Chapter 24 is called Veruca in the Nut Room. Mr. Wonka rushed on down the corridor. "The Nut Room," it said on the next door they came to. "All right," said Mr. Wonka. "Stop here for a moment and catch your breath and take a peek through the glass panel of this door. But don't go in. Whatever you do, don't go into the Nut Room. If you go in, you'll disturb the squirrels." Everybody crowded around the door. "Oh, look, Grandpa, look!" cried Charlie. "Squirrels!" shouted Veruca Salt. "Jeepers!" said Mike TV. It was an amazing sight. 100 squirrels were seated upon high stools around a large table. On the table there were mounds and mounds of walnuts, and the squirrels were all working away like mad, shelling the walnuts at a tremendous speed. "These squirrels are specially trained for getting the nuts out of walnuts," Mr. Wonka explained. "Why use squirrels?" Mike TV asked. "Why not use Oompa Loompas?" "Because," said Mr. Wonka, "Oompa Loompas can't get walnuts out of shells in one piece. They always break them in two. Nobody except squirrels can get walnuts whole out of a walnut shell every time. It is extremely difficult, but in my factory I insist upon using only whole walnuts. Therefore, I have to have squirrels to do the job." Aren't they wonderful, the way they get those nuts out? And see how they first tap each walnut with their knuckles to be sure that it's not a bad one. If it's bad, it makes a hollow sound, and they don't bother to open it. They just throw it down the garbage chute. There, look! Watch the squirrel nearest to us. He's got a bad one now. They watched the little squirrel as he tapped the walnut shell with his knuckles. He cocked his head to one side, listened intently, and then suddenly he threw the nut over his shoulder into a large hole in the floor. "Hey, Mummy!" shouted Veruca Salt suddenly. "I've decided I want a squirrel. Get me one of those squirrels." "Don't be silly, sweetheart," said Mrs. Salt. "These all belong to Mr. Wonka." "I don't care about that," shouted Veruca. "I want one. All I've got at home is 2 dogs and 4 cats and 6 bunny rabbits and 2 parakeets and 3 canaries and a green parrot and a turtle and a bowl of goldfish and a cage of white mice and a silly old hamster. I want a squirrel." "All right, my pet," Mrs. Salt said soothingly. "Mummy'll get you a squirrel just as soon as she possibly can." "But I don't want any old squirrel," Veruca shouted. "I want a trained squirrel." At this point, Mr. Salt, Veruca's father, stepped forward. "Very well, Wonka," he said importantly, taking out a wallet full of money. "How much do you want for one of these crazy squirrels? Name your price." "They're not for sale," Mr. Wonka answered. "She can't have one." "Who says I can't?" shouted Veruca. "I'm going to grab me a squirrel this very minute." "Don't," said Mr. Wonka quickly, but he was too late. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing, turned their heads, and stared at her with small black beady eyes. Veruca Salt stopped also and stared back at them. Then her gaze fell upon a pretty little squirrel sitting nearest to her at the end of the table. The squirrel was holding a walnut in its paws. "All right," Veruca said, "I'll have you." She reached out her hands to grab the squirrel, but as she did so, in that first split second when her hands started to go forward, there was a sudden flash of movement in the room, like a flash of brown lightning, and every single squirrel around the table took a flying leap toward her and landed on her body. 25 of them caught hold of her right arm and pinned it down. 25 more caught hold of her left arm and pinned that down. 25 more caught hold of her right leg and anchored it to the ground. 24 caught hold of her left leg. And the one remaining squirrel, obviously the leader of them all, climbed up on her shoulder and started tapping on the wretched girl's head with its knuckles. "Save her!" cried Mrs. Salt. "Veruca, come back! What are they doing to her?" "They're testing her to see if she's a bad nut," said Mr. Wonka. "You watch." Veruca struggled furiously, but the squirrels held her tight and she couldn't move. The squirrel on her shoulder went tapping on the side of her head with his knuckles. Then, all at once, the squirrels pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. "My goodness, she is a bad nut after all," said Mr. Wonka. Her head must have sounded quite hollow. Veruca kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The tiny, strong paws held her tightly, and she couldn't escape. "Where are they taking her?" shrieked Mrs. Salt. "She's going to go where all the other bad nuts go," said Mr. Willy Wonka. "Down the garbage chute." "By golly, she is going down the chute," said Mr. Salt, staring through the glass door at his daughter. "Then save her!" cried Mrs. Salt. "Too late," said Mr. Wonka. "She's gone." And indeed, she was. "But where?" shrieked Mrs. Salt, flapping her arms. "What happens to bad nuts? Where does the chute go to?" "That particular chute," Mr. Wonka told her, "runs directly to the great big main garbage pipe, which carries away all the rubbish from every part of the factory. All the floor sweepings and potato peelings and rotten cabbages and fish heads and stuff like that." "Who eats fish heads and cabbages and potatoes in this factory, I'd like to know," said Mike Teavee. "I do, of course," said Mr. Wonka. "You don't think I live on cacao beans, do you?" But, shrieked Mrs. Salt, "where does the great big pipe go in the end?" "Why, to the furnace, of course," said Mr. Wonka. "To the incinerator." Mrs. Salt opened her huge mouth and started to scream. "Don't worry," said Mr. Wonka. "There's always a chance that they've decided not to light the furnace today. A chance! Yelled Mrs. Salt. My darling Veruca, she'll be sizzled like a sausage. Quite right, my dear, said Mr. Salt. Now see here, Wonka, he added. I think you've gone just a shade too far this time. I do indeed. My daughter may be a bit of a frump, I don't mind admitting it, but that doesn't mean you can roast her to a crisp. I'll have you know I'm extremely cross about this. I really am. Oh, don't be cross, my dear sir, said Mr. Wonka. I expect she'll turn up sooner or later. She may not even have gone down at all. She may be stuck in the chute, just below the entrance hole, and if that's the case, all you have to do is go in and pull her up again. Hearing this, both Mr. and Mrs. Salt dashed into the nut room and ran over to the hole in the floor and peered in. Veruca! Shouted Mrs. Salt. Are you down there? There was no answer. Mrs. Salt bent down forward to get a closer look. She was kneeling right on the edge of the hole with her head down. It was a dangerous position to be in. She needed only one tiny push, one gentle nudge in the right place, and that is exactly what the squirrels gave her. Over she toppled, into the hole headfirst, screeching like a parrot. Good gracious me, said Mr. Salt as he watched his wife go tumbling down the hole. What a lot of garbage there's going to be today. He saw her disappearing into the darkness. What's it like down there, Angina? He called out. He leaned further forward. The squirrels rushed up behind him. Help! He shouted. But he was already toppling forward, and down the chute he went, just as his wife had done before him, and his daughter. Oh dear, cried Charlie, who was watching with the others through the door. What on earth is going to happen to them now? I expect someone will catch them at the bottom of the chute, said Mr. Wonka. But what about the great fiery incinerator? Asked Charlie. Well, they only light it every other day, said Mr. Wonka. Perhaps this is one of the days when they let it go out. You never know. They might be lucky. And that is where we will stop. I will see you again for another chapter of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Have a good evening. Bye, kids.